Now we will move on to the presentation of the issue papers. First, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dong-won Ko from Kwan University, Korea, who will present on implementation of the new financial consumer protection provisions in Korea, focusing on the supply side issues. Professor Ko pre-recorded a video for this seminar, so please enjoy his presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dong-won Ko, Professor of Law at Kwan University School of Law. I'd like to today introduce and discuss the implementation of product sale principles and also internal controls for financial consumers, mainly focusing on the Financial Consumer Protection Act, which was enacted the last year in 2020. Okay, so the main topics will be the overview of Financial Consumer Protection Act, and the next will be mainly discuss the conduct of business regulation under the Financial Consumer Protection Act. And finally, I also discuss about the internal control scheme for financial consumers. The main reason which I would like to discuss today is to introduce you about the recent regulation imposed by the Financial Consumer Protection and then try to pick up the issues raised in this implementation, and particularly focusing on the conduct of business regulation and also internal control system. Let's go to the background of enacting Financial Consumer Protection Act in Korea in the last year. This took effective on March 2021. And the first bill introduced in 2011 and further in 2017 proposed by the government and finally enacted in the last year, particularly prompted by the misselling cases of private hedge funds and the monetary damage incurred by the financial investors in 2019 and 2020. This new law is particularly adopting the same function and same regulation principle, and this law was enacted consolidating the various dispersed provisions relating to financial consumer protection under the Bank Act, related to the Banking and Capital Market Act, relating to the Securities Product and the Insurance Business Act for the insurance product. This law has been reflect the trends of enforcing of financial consumer protection regime globally since the 2008 global financial crisis. The major cases of mis-selling in Korea was the Kiko derivative product in 2008, and also the mis-selling of subordinate bonds in 2011, also mis-selling of investor product by Dongyang Securities Company. Also recently, as I mentioned earlier, in 2019, and mis-selling of derivative linked fund product, and also the mis-selling of private hedge fund product in the last year. So those mis-selling cases prompted the Korea government and the National Assembly to enact the new law. So today's main question and issues are following. First, newly launched regulation conduct of business such as suitability rule and explanation duty rule, properly and efficiently implemented. And so take a look at any deficiency in establishing such a regulatory framework. For example, we can see from the news that they are making a loan line and the bank accountants for signing loan contract or purchase fund product because of the reinforcing the procedure for regulation and the conduct of business. So we need to think about any problem in setting up such a regulatory framework. Another issue is about the internal control system of the financial institutions. So this internal control system is operated efficiently to prevent mis-selling of financial products. And so that recently the regulator, the Financial Services Supervisory Services, took enforcement action against the Chief Executive Office of the major financial institutions, including the bank and insurance company, because of the not setting up the efficient internal control system because there happened a mis-selling of private hedge funds. So we need to think about the regulatory enforcement action was proper, reasonable. Let's go to the overview of the Financial Consumer Protection Act. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, is reinforcing the conduct of business regulation in selling financial product, setting up the internal control scheme in regard to financial consumer protection, particularly adopting 6 principles for conduct of business regulation. They're also enhancing the remedies for damaged final consumers, such as consumers' right for terminating unlawful contracts, and also the improving the financial mediation scheme. They're also reducing the information asymmetry so that it's a disclosure requirement, expanding the scope of contents of financial product has been reinforced. And also the financial education regime has been enhanced. And also it reinforced the regulators' provisions, such as the regulators' product intervention power, and also introducing the punishable financial penalty. And this new law describes the entry regulation and describing the types of financial product sellers and financial advisors. First, there's a direct sellers of financial product, which means that the manufacturers of financial products, such as banks and securities firm, and also the insurance firm. The second category is agent or brokers of selling financial products, such as banks and the insurance company. The third category is the financial advisors for financial product, particularly in the independent financial advisors. And this new law will require them to file a registration to the Financial Services Commission and Financial Policy Regulators. And it also categorized the financial product as follows. First, the deposit type financial product, and second, the loan type financial product, and third is investment type financial products, such as fund products, and finally, the insurance type financial product. They also differentiate between the sophisticated financial consumers and the unsophisticated financial consumers in regard to the enforcing the regulation of the conduct of business. So this law defines the sophisticated financial consumers as the financial institutions such as the banks and the securities company, and also listed firms, and also the qualified individuals such as a wealth individual in respect of income or assets in case of an invest type of financial product. This new law defines the unsophisticated financial consumers, those excluded from the such sophisticated financial consumers. This new law is enforcing an internal control scheme, particularly in regard to the financial consumer protection. So it applies to financial advisors, directors, sellers, and agents or brokers of selling financial product. Okay, let's focus on the issues of conduct of business regulation. This new law introducing the 6 major principles for COB. First, the Suitability Principle, and second, Appropriateness Principle. Third, Principle of Duty to Explain. And first, Principle of Prohibition of Unfair Business Conduct. And 5, Principle for Prohibition Unfair Recommendation Activities. And finally, the principal regulation of fair and clear advertising. Okay, as the suitability principle, this applies to financial product sellers or financial advisors who provide advice on insurance type and financial product, investment type financial product, and loan type financial product, excluding the deposit type products. As I mentioned earlier, it applies only on sophisticated financial consumers, not to the sophisticated financial consumers. The stability principle has defined that financial product sellers or financial advisors are prohibited from recommending financial product not suitable to financial consumers when taking into account their asset or income, investment experience, or credit worthiness, or depending on types of financial product. The second principle is the appropriate principle. This preference applies to financial product seller or advisors who sell and provide advice on the insurance type financial product, investment type financial product, and loan type financial product, excluding deposit type product, as like in case of the suitability principle. It also applies only to the unsophisticated financial consumers. Appropriate principle means that if finance products that consumers want to purchase are believed to be unsuitable for them, and taking into consideration their asset or income, investment experience, or credit worth, depending on the type of finance products. And such finance product sellers or advisors are required to notify such financial consumers of the inappropriateness and then obtain the confirmation. The third principle is a duty to explain. This duty applies to all types of financial product and also applies only to the unsophisticated financial consumers. Duty explains defined as that financial product sellers, advisors are required to explain details of financial product as prescribed by the Consumer Protection Act, including the interest rate, exchange and prepayment penalties in case of loan type financial products, when they recommend the financial product to their final consumers or consumers request them to do so. Also, the principle of prohibition on unfair business conduct means that the financial product sellers or financial advisors are prohibited from conducting unfair business conduct, such as forcing financial consumers to execute contract against their will. Also, this new law describes the prohibition of unfair recommendation activities, so that the financial product sellers or financial advisors are prohibited from providing unfair recommendation activities in selling or providing advice on financial products. For example, they prohibit financial institutions from misrepresenting contents of financial product. And final, and the sixth principle as to the COB is the regulation for fair and clear advertising, so that the financial product sellers or financial advisors are required to make advertising fair and clear on financial product without misleading financial consumers' understanding of financial product. Okay, so the implementation problems and the issues, as I mentioned earlier, is this new law as reinforcing the COB principle, so that it causing the inconvenience to financial consumers at the bank account, taking more than 30 minutes for confirming whether financial consumers are professional or not, and for further fulfilling the duty to explain and suitability and appropriate rules. And also there's issues whether there's a coverage for the COB principle proper. Okay, let's go to the more in detail and the issues which I raised. First issue is according to the Financial Consumer Protection Act and the loan type financial product are newly subject to the suitability and appropriateness principle. So I'm wondering whether this is reasonable or acceptable, because prior to the new law, such loan type financial product were excluded from these principles. So I'd like to know whether what the cases of your country in regard to the coverage of the suitability and appropriate principle, particularly in the loan type financial product. Second is that under the FCP Act and the Suitability and Appropriateness rules do not apply even to the unsophisticated financial consumers who want to purchase financial product of private hedge fund as categorized as the investment type financial product, unless such a financial consumer requests so. So I'd like to ask questions whether this regulation is reasonable. And also would like to know the cases of your countries in regard to the selling of private hedge funds, and the suitability and appropriate rules is excluded from the applications. The third issue which I would like to raise is the duty to explain the coverage. Currently, the duty to explain rule does not apply to sophisticated financial consumers, as I mentioned, and only to unsophisticated financial consumers. So I'm raising questions whether this duty to explain rule should also apply to the such sophisticated financial consumers, because I believe that sophisticated financial consumers also need to understand the details of financial products when they would like to purchase such financial product. So I'm wondering whether your country is having this kind of coverage for the duty to explanation rule. And the fourth issue which I'd like to ask question is the procedure for the implementing the COB. As I mentioned earlier, there's a long line at the bank counters for discharging the duty to explain and suitability and appropriateness, which is causing the inconvenience to financial consumers. Because financial product sellers are required to investigate financial consumer information through making questions and consulting, and also to obtain their signature, including the online signature or recording, in regard to suitability and appropriateness rules, and further to explain material information on financial product to financial consumers and obtain their signature or recording. In regard to the duty to explain. So I'm questions whether this kind of procedures are proper and adequate. And so would like to know whether what's your situation of your countries in regard to the procedure for implementing the COB. And another issue about the internal control scheme for financial consumers. And according to the Financial Institutions Corporate Governance Act, financial institutions, including banks and securities firms, are required to set up the internal control standards the employees should comply with, containing the organization structure, the procedure for employees to comply in discharging their duties, the roles of director and executive office, and conference office to conduct in relation to internal controls. And also, financial institutions is required to employ a qualified and compliance officer in charge of implementing the internal control scheme. And there was the very keen controversial issues of CEO's responsibility for setting up the internal control standard. Financial Supervisory Service, a regulatory execution body, and last year decided to make a sanction against the CEOs of financial institutions involved in mis-selling financial product of private hedge funds, arguing that the CEOs are responsible for not setting up the effective internal control standard because mis-selling of private hedge funds happened in the selling that the product to customers. In contrast, the CEOs asserted that they should not be sanctioned because Financial Institution Corporate Governance Act is silent whether CEOs are responsible for establishing the internal control standard. So the issues I direct ask is whether CEOs are responsible for not setting up the effective internal control standard. If the concerned financial institutions are involved in mis-selling cases, incurring financial damage to financial consumers. So I'd like to know whether there are any the issues in regard to the internal control and the CEO's responsibility for that. So conclusion. As you may know, the Financial Consumer Protection Act in Korea is reinforcing the protection of financial consumers. However, this giving much heavy burdens to financial institutions. But I think that enhancing the protection of financial consumers contribute to upgrading the financial industry. However, this also is causing the inconvenience to final consumers. So that I think that more balanced approach for reinforcing protection of final consumers and the inconvenience to final consumers should be pursued. That's the main agenda for Korea to implement the newly enacted Financial Consumer Protection Act. Thank you very much.